want to be clear about something before I start. I'm not a whistleblower. I'm not trying to expose anyone or any agency, and I'm not looking for attention. I'm writing this because I don't know what else to do, and because I need someone, anyone, to tell me that what I found has a rational explanation. I need someone to tell me I'm wrong about what the files are, because if I'm not wrong, then I don't think anything any of us does has ever mattered. My name is Joe Parrish. For 11 months, I worked as a record specialist at a facility called the Hargrove Federal Records Annex, located about 40 miles east of Cheyenne, Wyoming. If you look it up, you won't find much. There's a line item in the GSA's property registry and a brief mention in a 2004 appropriations report, but that's about it. From the outside, it looks like a decommissioned agricultural research station, a cluster of beige buildings behind a chain-link fence, surrounded by nothing but dry grass and wind. Most of the facility is above ground, but the archive itself, the real archive, the one I worked in, is below. I took the job because I needed one. I'd spent 3 years after grad school bouncing between adjunct positions and part-time library work, and when a posting for a GS7 records specialist appeared on USA Jobs, I applied this same night. The listing was vague, cataloging and maintaining physical records in a secure federal facility. It required a background check, which I passed. It required relocation to rural Wyoming, which I accepted. The pay was decent. The benefits were federal grade, and I told myself it would look good on a resume. My supervisor was a woman named Claire Duchesnain, late 50s, gray-streaked hair she kept in a tight bun, reading glasses perpetually hanging from a beaded chain around her neck. She had the demeanor of a veteran librarian, precise, patient, and completely uninterested in small talk. On my first day, she walked me through the above-ground offices, showed me the break room and the bathroom and the supply closet, and then took me to the elevator at the back of Building C. The elevator only went down one button, no floor indicator. When the doors opened, the temperature dropped about 15 degrees. The hallway ahead was lit by fluorescent tubes, some of them flickering in that lazy, irregular way that meant they'd needed replacing for years and nobody had bothered. The floor was poured concrete. The walls painted cinder block in a shade of green that hadn't been manufactured since the 70s. It smelled like old paper and something faintly chemical, toner maybe, or some kind of preservative. "This is sub-level 1, Claire said, walking ahead of me without looking back. "There are 3 sub-levels total. You'll be working on this one, primarily. Levels 2 and 3 are restricted." I didn't ask what was on levels 2 and 3. Not then. I wish I'd never asked at all. Sub-level 1 was enormous. I don't know the exact square footage, but the main corridor stretched so far ahead that the far end dissolved into a greenish haze under the failing lights. Filing cabinets lined both walls, standard government issue, gunmetal gray, 5 drawers each. Some had labels, most didn't. Branching off from the main corridor were smaller rooms, each one packed with more cabinets, more shelving units, more bankers' boxes stacked to the ceiling. Claire explained my job. I was to continue the cataloging work that my predecessor had begun. Each file needed to be logged in a master index, subject, date of creation, originating agency, classification level, and a brief content summary. Most of the files were exactly what you'd expect from a government archive. Census data, environmental surveys, decommissioned military procurement records, obsolete policy drafts, the kind of paperwork that accumulates like sediment over decades of bureaucratic activity. For the first 3 weeks, that's all I found. Boring, harmless, unremarkable paperwork. I settled into a rhythm. I'd arrive at 8, take the elevator down, work through a section of cabinets, log each file, and resurface at 5. I ate lunch alone in the break room. I drove home to my rented apartment in Cheyenne. I watched TV, I slept. Then I opened cabinet 1143F. It was in one of these side rooms, a narrow space I'd been putting off because the overhead light didn't work and I had to use a desk lamp plugged into an extension cord. The cabinet was in the far corner, partially blocked by a stack of boxes. When I pulled the top drawer open, the files inside looked different from the others. The folders were a slightly different shade of manila, newer somehow, even though the filing dates on the tabs were old. and the tabs themselves were labeled with a coding system I hadn't seen anywhere else in the archive. The first file I pulled was labeled PAN 2019-0034CA-tron. Inside was a single document, 7 pages long, printed on standard government letterhead from an agency I didn't recognize, the Office of Predictive Archival Notation. There was no return address, no signature block, no distribution list, just a date of creation, March 3rd, 2016, and a dense block of text. It read like a report, clinical, detached, structured in numbered paragraphs. It described in meticulous detail the collapse of a pedestrian bridge in a mid-sized American city. It named the city Greenville, South Carolina. It named the bridge the Heritage Corridor Walkway. It described the weather on the day of the collapse, overcast, 62 degrees, light wind from the southeast. It listed the number of casualties, 4 dead, 11 injured. It named the dead. The date of the event described in the file was October 17, 2019. The file was created in 2016. I stared at it for a long time. Then I took out my phone and searched for the Greenville Bridge collapse. It had happened. October 17, 2019. 4 dead, 11 injured. The names of the deceased matched the file exactly. The weather description was accurate. Every detail, down to the direction of the wind, was correct. I sat there under the desk lamp in that narrow room, and I felt something I can only describe as a wrongness, a physical sensation like the floor tilting beneath me, like gravity had shifted by 1 degree, and everything was slightly imperceptibly off. I told myself it was a retroactive report. Someone had documented the event after it happened and misfiled the creation date, a clerical error. Government agencies make mistakes, that's practically their core function. I pulled the next file from the drawer, PAN 2021-01112-C-Cron, created January 8, 2018. It described a chemical plant explosion in East Texas, dated for March 2021. I searched it, it had happened. Every detail matched. The next file, PAN 2022-0067-Z-Ron, created November 2017. A school bus accident in rural Minnesota, dated for September 2022. It had happened. I went through every file in that drawer. There were 14. Every single one described an event that occurred after the file's creation date. Every single one was accurate. Not approximately accurate, perfectly accurate. Names, dates, locations, body counts, weather conditions. Some of them included details that hadn't been reported in the news. Details I could only verify by cross-referencing with NTSB reports and FEMA records I accessed through the archive's internal network. I didn't go home at 5 that day. I stayed until nearly midnight, moving through the adjacent drawers, finding more files with the same coding prefix, PAN, dozens of them, then hundreds. Not all of them described disasters. Some described elections, policy changes, corporate mergers, scientific discoveries. One described the exact wording of a Supreme Court ruling 2 years before it was issued. Another described the trajectory and naming of a hurricane that wouldn't form for another 3 years. They varied in length and specificity, but they all shared the same characteristics. They were written in the past tense about events that, at the time of their creation, had not yet occurred. And they were all, without exception, correct. I didn't tell Claire immediately. I wanted to understand what I was looking at before I brought it up, because I knew how it sounded. But after a week of working through the PAN files, I'd found over 300 by then. I couldn't keep it to myself. I found her in her office on the ground floor, a small room with no windows and a dying pothos plant on the filing cabinet. I closed the door and told her what I'd found. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she took off her reading glasses, folded them, and set them on the desk. "How far into the PAN series have you gotten?" she asked. I blinked. "You know about them?" "Joel, I've worked here for 23 years. Then, you know what they are? You know they describe events before they happen." "I know what they appear to describe. It's not what they appear to do. I've verified dozens of them. The accuracy is, it's not possible. No predictive model, no think tank, no intelligence analysis could produce this level of detail years in advance. Some of these files predict the names of people who weren't born. Yet, when the file was created, Claire watched me for a moment. There was something in her expression that I couldn't read. Not surprise, not concern, but something older and heavier. Like a weight she'd been carrying so long had become part of her posture. "Your predecessor found them too," she said. "About 6 months into his tenure, he had the same reaction you're having." "What happened to him?" "He requested a transfer. It was granted." "Did he report the files? Did anyone investigate the origin of Joel?" She said it quietly, but it stopped me. "The files are part of the archive. They've been part of the archive since before I started here. And I suspect, since before this facility was built, your job is to catalog them, not to investigate them, not to analyze them, not to verify them against external events. Log the file, note its contents, move on. You're telling me to just ignore them?" "I'm telling you to do your job." She put her glasses back on and turned to her computer screen. "The files in the Pan series are cataloged under a separate index. I'll give you the access codes. Log them the same way you log everything else." I left her office feeling like I'd just been told the building was on fire, but to please continue alphabetizing the bookshelf. For a while, I tried to do what she said. I logged the Pan files like any others. Subject date, originating agency, classification level, summary. I developed a shorthand for the summaries: infrastructure failure, Greenville SC, October 2019, 4 fatalities, as if reducing the impossible to a line in a spreadsheet could make it manageable. But I couldn't stop reading them. Every morning I'd come down the elevator and go straight to the Pan cabinets. I told myself I was being thorough. I told myself it was part of my job. But the truth was simpler and worse than that. I was looking for files about the future. Because not all of the Pan files described events that had already occurred. Some of them described events that hadn't happened yet. I found one dated 2024, still 2 years out from my present, describing a passenger train derailment in central Ohio. Another described a Category 4 hurricane making landfall on the Georgia coast in 2025. Another described a building fire in a specific apartment complex in Chicago, naming the address, the date, the number of dead. These files sat in the same drawers as the others, in the same folders, printed on the same paper. There was nothing to distinguish them from the verified files except that the events they described were still in the future. I started keeping a personal log. I recorded the details of every future-dated Pan file I found, with the intention of checking them against reality as the dates arrived. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like I was losing my grip, but I want you to understand, at that point, I had verified over 200 files against historical records, and not one of them had been wrong. Not one. The statistical impossibility of that is so vast it ceases to be a number and becomes something else. It becomes a condition. What I didn't realize, what I should have realized, was that the archive was aware of my attention. I don't know how else to phrase that. I don't mean the building was alive or that the filing cabinets had feelings. I mean that the archive responded to being read. It started with the new files. I came in on a Monday morning and found a folder sitting on top of cabinet 143F, not inside a drawer on top, as if someone had placed it there. The folder was the same slightly off shade of manila as the others in the Pan series. Inside was a single document. The creation date was that day's date. The content described a gas leak explosion at a restaurant in Albuquerque, New Mexico, dated for the following Wednesday. No one else had been in the archive. The security log showed my badge as the only entry for the past 72 hours. Claire worked exclusively on the ground floor. The elevator required authorization. No one had come down. I checked the news the following Thursday. A gas leak explosion at a restaurant in Albuquerque. 3 dead. The address, the time, the cause, all matched the file. After that, new files began appearing regularly. Not every day, but several times a week. I'd arrive in the morning and find them waiting. Sometimes on the cabinet, sometimes in a drawer I'd emptied the day before, sometimes on the small desk I'd set up in the side room. They were always about events that hadn't happened yet, and they were always right. I started arriving earlier. I set up a small camera, just my phone, propped against a box, set to record overnight. The first few nights captured nothing. The files appeared between frames, as if they simply materialized in the gap between 1 second and the next. One moment the desk was empty, the next there was a folder. No movement, no shadow, no transition, just absence and then presence. I showed the footage to Claire. She watched it, expressionless, and handed my phone back. "Has this happened before?" I asked. "The files appear," she said. "They've always appeared. That's part of their nature." "Their nature? You're talking about them like they're organic?" "I'm talking about them like someone who's been here for 23 years, Joel. I've watched 6 people cycle through your position. You're the first one to set up a camera, but you're not the first one to ask these questions. The answers don't help. You never tried to figure out where they come from?" "I know where they come from." She said this with a flatness that stopped me cold. "They come from the archive." "That's circular." "Yes," she said, "it is." That conversation was the last time Claire was helpful. After that, she became evasive, then avoidant. She stopped making eye contact when I passed her in the hallway. She started leaving the facility before I came up from the archive at the end of the day. I'd find notes on my desk, procedural reminders, supply orders. But she communicated in person less and less. I should have taken that as a warning. Instead, I took it as permission. I started exploring beyond my assigned section. Sub-level 1 was vast, and I'd only been working in a small portion of it. The farther I went from the elevator, the older the files became, and the stranger the organizational system. In the more remote sections, the cabinets weren't labeled at all. The files inside were typed on paper that felt brittle, yellowed, almost powdery. Some were handwritten in ink that had faded to a pale brown. These older files were different from the Pan series. They didn't use the same coding system, and their content was harder to parse. But they described the same thing: events that, relative to their creation date, had not yet occurred. I found one from 1962 that described the assassination of a world leader in 1963. I found one from 1954 that described a specific plane crash in 1957. I found one from 1948 that described a volcanic eruption in 1980. The archive had been doing this for decades, maybe longer. The oldest file I could find was dated 1931, but the paper was in such poor condition that parts of it were illegible. For all I knew, there were older ones deeper in sections I hadn't reached. And then there was the matter of sub-level 2. The stairwell at the far end of the main corridor had a heavy steel door with an electronic lock. My badge didn't work on it. I'd tried once early on and gotten a red light and a short beep. I hadn't thought much about it at the time. Claire had told me levels 2 and 3 were restricted, and I'd accepted that the way you accept most things in a government job, as a boundary set by someone above you, for reasons you don't need to understand. But that was before the PAN files, before the appearing documents, before I realized that the archive wasn't just a storage facility. It was something else, something that defied every category I had for understanding the world. I needed to see what was below. I spent 2 weeks trying to find the access code for the stairwell door. I searched Claire's office when she left for the day. I went through every administrative file in the ground level records. I checked the facility's internal network for security protocols. Eventually, I found it, not in a file, but written in pencil on the inside of a supply closet door in Building C, along with a series of other codes that looked like they'd been there since the facility was built. 4 digits, 7734. The door opened. The stairwell was narrow and poorly lit. The stairs were metal grating, and my footsteps echoed in a way that made it sound like someone was walking behind me. Sub-level 2 was structurally similar to the level above. Cinder block walls, fluorescent lights, concrete floor, but it felt different. The air was colder and had a thickness to it, a density, as if it hadn't been circulated in a long time. The lights worked, but they were dimmer, and the color of the light was different, less white, more amber, like the fluorescent tubes were from a different era. The filing cabinets on this level were different too. They were larger, older, made of a heavier gauge metal. Some of them had padlocks. The files inside were organized not by event but by person. Each file was dedicated to a single individual, a name on the tab, inside a dossier, but not the kind you'd find in a personnel file or an intelligence report. These were life records, complete, comprehensive, chronological accounts of a person's entire existence, from birth to death. I pulled one at random. A man named Gerald Fisk, born 1971. The file described his childhood in Marion, Ohio, his education, his marriage, his career as a plumber, his divorce, his medical history, a torn meniscus in 2008, a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes in 2014. It described things no government database would contain. The time he'd broken a window throwing a baseball when he was 11. The name of a girl he'd kissed at a high school party. The specific words his father had said to him on the day he left for college. The file ended with his death. Heart attack, February 2031. He was still alive. I felt the wrongness again. Stronger now. Not like the floor tilting, but like the walls breathing. Like the space around me had contracted by an inch. I put the file back and opened another. A woman named Diane Ochoa, born 1985, still alive. Her file was the same, impossibly detailed, impossibly intimate, and it ended with her death in 2040. Ovarian cancer. It described the hospital room, the names of the nurses. I went through file after file. Some of the people were already dead, and the file's descriptions of their deaths matched public records. Some were still alive, and their files described deaths that hadn't happened yet. All of them were written in the same clinical, detached government prose as the PAN files upstairs, as if the total sum of a human life could be reduced to an administrative record. I don't know how long I spent on sublevel 2 that first time, hours at least. I forgot to eat. I forgot to check the time. The archive had that effect. It swallowed you, consumed your attention, made the outside world feel distant and theoretical. By the time I climbed back up to the ground floor, the facility was dark and the parking lot was empty. I drove home in a state that I can only describe as detached. The highway was empty, the sky was clear. I could see more stars than I'd ever noticed before, and for some reason that frightened me. The idea that there was more up there than I'd been paying attention to, that the universe was larger and more detailed than I'd bothered to observe. I went back to sublevel 2 the next day, and the day after that, I was looking for something specific. I think you already know what it was. It took me 4 days to find the right section. The filing system on that level was alphabetical but fragmented. The P's were split across 3 different rooms, with no apparent logic to the distribution. But I found it eventually, in a cabinet against the back wall of a room so far from the stairwell that the fluorescent lights had given way to bare incandescent bulbs hanging from the ceiling. Parrish, Joel Matthew. My file was thick, much thicker than I expected. The folder was heavy in my hands, and when I opened it, the pages were dense with text, single-space margins filled to the edges. It started with my birth, March 14th, 1993, Mercy General Hospital, Portland, Oregon. It described my parents, my childhood home, the dog we'd had when I was 6, a beagle mix named Captain that we'd gotten from a shelter. It described things I'd forgotten, the pattern on my bedroom wallpaper, the name of my first grade teacher, the exact wording of the note my mother had put in my lunchbox on the first day of school. It described my entire life. Grad school, the failed relationships, the job applications, the phone interview with Claire. It described my first day at the archive, the elevator ride down, the green walls and the flickering lights. It described my discovery of the PAN files, my conversations with Claire, my decision to set up the camera. It described my finding the access code on the supply closet door. I flipped forward, the text continued past the present day. The next paragraph described me standing in that exact room, reading my own file, feeling the sweat on my palms and the tightness in my chest. It described the way my hands shook as I turned the pages. It described the thoughts going through my head, and it was accurate. It was exactly right. The file knew what I was thinking. As I read it, I kept reading. I couldn't stop. The remaining pages described the next several months of my life in the same exhaustive detail. I won't share everything. Some of it was mundane. Grocery trips, phone calls with my mother, a recurring dream about standing in an empty field. Some of it was not mundane. According to the file, I would begin experiencing a phenomenon it referred to as temporal dissonance. I would start losing time, not in the way you lose time when you're absorbed in something, but literally gaps in my memory, hours unaccounted for, mornings when I'd wake up in rooms I didn't remember entering. The file described these episodes with the same clinical neutrality it described everything else, as if they were just another data point in the administrative record of my existence. The file described me returning to sublevel 2 repeatedly, compulsively, spending longer and longer in the archive. It described me finding the stairwell to sublevel 3. And then the file ended, not with my death. That's what I expected, a date, a cause, a clinical summary like the others. But my file didn't end that way. The last page simply stopped mid-sentence, as if the typist had gotten up and walked away. The final words were, "Joel descends to the 3rd sublevel and understands the nature of the that was it." No period, no completion, just a sentence reaching for something it never arrived at. I stood in that room for a long time after I finished reading. The incandescent bulbs hummed above me. The air was cold and motionless. Somewhere, deep in the archive, metal settled against metal, a filing cabinet adjusting, a drawer shifting, and the sound traveled through the concrete like something breathing. I put my file back. I walked to the stairwell. I went up to the ground floor, out of the building, into the parking lot. I sat in my car. The sun was going down. The wind was blowing hard enough to rock the car on its suspension. I should have driven away. I should have gone home, packed a bag, and driven until Wyoming was a memory. That's what a rational person would have done. But the file had described what I would do next, and the file had been right about everything else. I went back the next day. The temporal dissonance started 3 weeks later, exactly as the file predicted. I lost it Tuesday afternoon. I was at my desk at 2 p.m., and then I was in my car in the parking lot, and it was dark and cold, and my badge log showed I'd left the archive at 7:43 p.m., but I had no memory of the intervening 5 hours. It happened again 4 days later, then again. The gaps grew longer and more frequent. I started finding things I didn't remember doing, notes in my own handwriting that I didn't recall writing, files in the Pan series that I'd apparently cataloged during the gaps but had no memory of reading. My log entries for those files were accurate and detailed, which meant that during the episodes I was functional, working, reading, writing. But whatever was happening during those hours, my conscious mind wasn't present for it. I was terrified. But the terror existed alongside something else, a compulsion, a gravitational pull toward the archive that I couldn't resist and didn't fully want to. The file had described this too. It had described my inability to leave, my awareness that I was following a script I'd already read, and my decision to continue anyway because I needed to know how the sentence ended. The door to sublevel 3 was at the bottom of the stairwell past sublevel 2. Another steel door. Another electronic lock. I tried 7734. It didn't work. I tried every code I'd found in the supply closet. None of them worked. For weeks, I searched. I went through every file on sublevel 2 looking for the access code. I tore apart the administrative records on the ground floor. I even tried to physically force the door, which was futile. It was reinforced steel bolted into a concrete frame. And then one morning, I woke up on the other side of it. I was on the floor. The concrete was cold against my cheek. My badge was in my hand. The door behind me was closed. When I stood up and looked around, I was in a corridor that looked nothing like the levels above. Sublevel 3 was not a records storage facility. The walls were bare concrete, unfinished, rough to the touch. The floor was uneven, as if it had been poured hastily or over existing terrain. The lighting came from a source I couldn't identify. There were no fixtures, no bulbs, no visible wiring, but the space was illuminated in a pale, diffuse glow that seemed to emanate from the concrete itself. It was warm down there, warm and humid, like the inside of a living thing. There were no filing cabinets. There were no shelves or boxes or desks. The corridor was empty, and it stretched ahead of me in a straight line that seemed to narrow as it went. the walls converging gradually until, at the farthest point I could see, they appeared to nearly touch. I walked, I don't know for how long. The corridor didn't branch or turn. The walls got closer, the ceiling got lower. The warmth increased. After what might have been 20 minutes or 2 hours, the corridor opened into a room. The room was circular, maybe 30 feet across. The walls were the same unfinished concrete, but here they were, covered floor to ceiling in text, not printed, not typed, carved. Someone had carved words directly into the concrete, in letters so small and so densely packed that from a distance the walls looked textured like rough stone. But up close, every inch was covered in language. I leaned in and read. It was the same clinical prose, the same detached, bureaucratic voice. But it wasn't describing individual events or individual lives, it was describing everything. The text was continuous, no paragraph breaks, no headings, no organizational structure, and it moved fluidly between subjects, between scales, between time frames. One sentence described the formation of a cloud over the Pacific. The next described a woman in Uruguay deciding not to answer her phone. The next described the death of a star 4 billion years from now. The next described the pattern of cracks in a sidewalk in a town that wouldn't be built for another century. It was everything, every event, every moment, every quantum of experience that would ever occur, rendered in dry government language and carved into the walls of a room beneath Wyoming. I walked the circumference. I read for what felt like hours. The text continued without interruption, without repetition, and without end. It wrapped around the room, and I realized with a sickness that started in my stomach and spread outward, it continued below the floor. The concrete beneath my feet was carved too. The text was under me. It was above me. The ceiling was carved. It was everywhere, and it was still being written. I know that because I watched it happen. Standing in the center of the room, staring at a section of wall at eye level, I saw a letter appear, not quickly, slowly, the way frost forms on glass. The surface of the concrete shifted, hairline cracks forming and deepening, and over the course of perhaps 30 seconds, a word emerged, then another, then another. The wall was writing itself. I read the words as they appeared. They described a man standing in a circular room beneath the ground, watching words appear on a wall. They described his breathing shallow, rapid. They described his heart rate. They described the exact thought passing through his mind at that moment, which was, this is what was always going to happen. The file was right. That was the thought. And reading it was like standing between two mirrors and watching the reflections fold inward into infinity, each image containing the next, each one perfectly faithful and perfectly useless. I understood then the nature of the archive. The sentence in my file, Joel descends to the 3rd sublevel and understands the nature of the... I knew how it ended, even though it had never been completed on paper. The archive wasn't predicting the future. It wasn't recording events before they happened through some impossible intelligence or supernatural foresight. The archive was the future. It was the mechanism. The files on sublevel 1. The life records on sublevel 2. The carved walls on sublevel 3. They weren't descriptions of reality. They were the source code. Reality was the output. The world above, every cloud, every death, every cracked sidewalk and unanswered phone call was a printout generated by the text on these walls. Nothing had ever happened that wasn't written here first. I don't know how long I stood in that room. When I finally moved, my legs were stiff and my vision was blurred and the words were still appearing, line by line, the wall producing the future at the steady pace of a government clerk who would never stop typing and had never started. I climbed back up. The door to the stairwell was open. I climbed past sublevel 2, past sublevel 1. I took the elevator up. I walked out of building C into daylight so bright it hurt. I drove to Cheyenne. I packed my apartment. I loaded my car and drove east. I drove for 14 hours without stopping and checked into a motel in Nebraska and slept for 2 days. When I woke up, I called the facility's administrative number and told them I was resigning, effective immediately. The woman on the phone, not Claire, someone I'd never spoken to, said she understood and that my final paycheck would be mailed. She didn't ask why. She didn't try to talk me out of it. That was 5 months ago. I live in Illinois now. I have a job at a public library. I shelve books and help people use the printer and answer questions about library cards. It is the most normal, most mundane job I could find, and I chose it deliberately because I needed to be surrounded by the ordinary. But the thing about the ordinary is that it doesn't feel ordinary anymore. It feels performed. It feels like something being read aloud from a page. I keep thinking about the walls, about the text appearing letter by letter, word by word, about the fact that somewhere beneath Wyoming, the concrete is still carving itself, still producing the future in dry, measured prose. Right now, as I type this right now as you read it, there's a file for you too. That's what I can't stop thinking about. There's a file with your name on it, in a cabinet on sub-level 2 of a facility you'll never see. And it describes everything you've ever done and everything you'll ever do. And the last entry is the date and manner of your death. You already know what it says. You just don't know that you know. I haven't checked the news for the events described in the future dated PAN files I logged. I can't. I already know what I'd find. The train derailment, the hurricane, the apartment fire in Chicago. They're in the walls. They were always in the walls. 3 days ago, I found something on my desk at the library. It was sitting on top of a stack of returned books, as if someone had placed it there while I wasn't looking. A manila folder, slightly off shade, no label on the tab. Inside was a single page, a new file, freshly printed. With yesterday's date, it described in 7 numbered paragraphs a series of events at my library, events that haven't happened yet. I don't work in the archive anymore, but I don't think that matters. I don't think it ever mattered. The archive doesn't care whether you work in it, it works in you.